Welcome to the sixth episode of MO Forum. We've been talking about various issues of relevance to our society and where we're going, and none more relevant than the direction that the media is taking with the new technologies, the advent of social media. And we're joined by Chris Uhlmann today, who I think everyone knows from 7:30 Report fame, and he's doing some other work for the ABC at the moment, which will become more evident in the coming months. But Chris, thanks very much for joining us for MO Forum.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks for having me. And the least I can do is to return the favour after all the interviews you've done with us.
We have done a few, there's no doubt about that. Chris, we were talking off air about your memories that don't extend back so far, like you don't recall the 1950s, you recall the late 80s and the technology that was around then. Can you share that with our viewers?
I came into journalism in 1989, pretty late. In fact, I was 29 years old at the time.
A late bloomer.
I was very late bloomer. Some people think that I haven't yet bloomed. But anyway, 29 years old, and as a copy kid into the Canberra Times. I mean, you think about the differences in the technology then. So it was a black and white newspaper. In fact, it was quite a while before the Canberra Times got a colour press. And at the time that I was there, that was one of the big things, the need to move into a colour press. The expense of getting machinery like that, and particularly when you can't run it all the time. The fact that there was an internal computing system called Coyote, but any messaging that we had was only within the office. So the computing system was quite limited. They were just moving to the layout system that they were trying to get up. And if you went out to the back of the newspaper, the old Printed and Kindred Industries Union was out there, and they ruled the shop floor out there. They were the ones who, and it was cut and paste. You know, you would print out a long sheet of the way a story would look. They would take it out the back, and they would literally cut and paste this thing up, then put it onto drums, and then the drums would go out and they'd run the presses. So very labour-intensive industry, both on the journalistic shop floor and behind the scenes. And almost from the moment that I started, that started to break down, to change.
Oh, what about the internet?
No such thing.
Email?
No such thing. The emails that we had were little messages that we could send amongst ourselves, but not outside the building. And I remember, because I was a copy kid, which was just mainly a job of moving bits of paper around the office and going getting people's lunch and dinner, was that out the back there were still telex machines. We were still getting some of our information that way. They'd fire up every now and then. You'd hear the chatter of them, and you'd go and pull something off. And then they didn't take long before they moved out, but they were still there.
Well, tell me now, was it Al Gore or Malcolm Turnbull or you who invented the internet?
I think none of the above. I think to his credit, at least Malcolm doesn't claim to have invented it. Oh, perhaps not anywhere but in Australia.
Oh, right, yes, he might have introduced the internet to Australia.
But again, like to roll forward, and we're sort of now in the late 1990s, I've moved out of the newspaper, which by now has a colour press, but again, the number of jobs inside the organisation shrinks. And this is the thing too that happens all the way along. As you can start doing layout on a computer screen, as everyone would know, they can do themselves now at home.
Yeah.
But this is a huge revolution in the way that business is done in papers, because it means you can start to get rid of the people who work out the back and cutting up the bits and pieces of paper that you used to send out to them. So those jobs are beginning to collapse, to get smaller and smaller. More of it's being thrown from the
back room to
the front room. Yeah. More being done by journalists. Industrial disputation about this the whole way along, as you would imagine. But you wind forward now until the late 1990s, and I'm working at the ABC, and there's one computer where we have this thing called the internet, which we can get.
That's it.
Yeah, that's
it.
And you know, people I remember doing a story in, and I can't remember the year, but maybe 1992, 1991. On witches in Canberra. Now, the only reason that this becomes of any interest at all, apart from the fact that they were mostly public servants, is that somebody said to me...
We should do a separate MO for it.
But there was someone said, oh, well, you know, you can find a lot of information on that sort of stuff about Wiccan rights and things on the internet. And I said, what's that?
The internet.
And they said, well, you know, if at a university, universities have access to this sort of stuff. And so I thought, well, I rang the ANU and made an appointment with the person that was running this thing, went out to have a look at it, was astounded by this. And I said, look, I want to find out about this, you know, what does this do? How does it work? The thing I did notice though at the time, there seemed to be a whole lot of, I said to them, what are all those images that we can see as they come? Oh, there's a lot of porn.
Oh,
There's
right,
a lot of porn on
okay,
the internet
yeah.
apparently. I was really interested, but didn't dare ask
Oh,
at
no,
the time.
no,
I didn't
no.
look. And
Well,
I didn't inhale, if you like.
so at that time, when you saw that, you could have invented the Uhlmann, but someone else came along and invented Google. So
Well, that's right. Well, I remember the first search engine that I used at the ABC, which, you know, people who are au fait with these things probably were using things way before that. But the first one that I got to routinely use was a thing called Northern Light. That was a search
I don't
engine that
remember
we
it.
used, and look, God knows if it still exists
Yeah.
anymore. So it was a while before
Google
we heard
probably
the word
bought
Google. Yeah, they probably did. It's assumed the whole thing.
Yeah. So what implications does this have? I mean, even the time you're talking about, since then there's been an explosion in technologies, such that you get upstarts like me doing MO forums, and there's blogging all over the place. On Twitter, you can access electronic, so it's just 140 characters, but it'll have a link, and you can click onto that link and it brings you into a whole new world of someone's interviews like this, or their thoughts, or Melanie Safka singing, or whatever. So how is this availability of a multiplicity of platforms affecting the mainstream media?
It's extraordinary. And if you think about it in the past, and you would understand this as an economist, it's a very simple concept. The barrier in the past was the cost. So publishing a newspaper was an extremely expensive thing. The presses that the Canberra Times went out to buy, and I don't remember the actual cost, but they scoured the world to find a colour press that they could afford that would do the job. Then when they got it, they had to find other things to do with it apart from simply running the newspaper, because otherwise it wasn't commercially viable.
So printing junk mail.
That's right. They had to print stuff all the time to ensure that they were getting value for money. What we're doing now would have been inconceivable, and the cost of television, I know from doing this on a daily basis, even now in a commercial area or for the ABC, is really, really expensive. It's very, very slow. But everybody is a publisher now. Everyone has access to be able to do this. So there's been a huge democratisation, if you like, of the media landscape. I think we are just at the cusp of it, beginning to understand what the possibilities are. The cost, if you like, in the old media terms, is that once upon a time in Australia we had a settlement where the newspapers could all make money because all the eyes went there to read print, or they went on to television. All our 3 commercial television news stations had a very, very nice settlement with government, so they all actually made money no matter what kind of programming they were really putting on, and that paid for the journalism.
Yeah, I see.
That model is broken. That model is completely broken now, and the problem that everyone has, and I have real sympathy for them in the commercial world, and one of the reasons why we see such a strong advocacy out of News Limited to try and limit what the ABC can do, is that as long as people can get this stuff for free, how do you build a commercial enterprise around that? How do you actually pay for the journalism? I think it's a really important question for how journalism progresses in the future. I would hate to see an environment where we see the disappearance of the commercial news media. I think that they'll get a handle on it soon, but they're all experimenting now, and I think it was the former head of News Limited who said, look, in the old world, we knew what a dollar was. In the real world, a dollar was a dollar. Now, it's 18 cents. You know, that's about what we can get when we transfer our stuff behind paywalls. It's not enough.
Right, I see. So the paywalls, the print versions of their newspapers, the circulation, as I understand, is declining, perhaps in some areas more than others, and in some types of newspapers more than others, but nothing seems to be growing. Everything's declining. So they're looking at ways of making money by their online versions, but you have to go behind the paywall, because I understand that the advertising, and there is advertising, you've got to click a little cross to get rid of it, isn't as attractive as the advertising in the old print media was. That is, it isn't effective.
No, the problem you've got too is that, again, in the old print media, one of the first jobs that I had as a copy kid is that journalists like to believe that people bought the newspapers for the journalism. In fact, what used to pay, particularly for Fairfax, were the classified ads and the weekends, what they call the rivers of gold.
The great
big chunky bits.
Sydney Morning Herald that landed on, you could hear it land on the front line, wake you up at 6 o'clock in the morning.
And it was really, really lucrative. And so the way a newspaper was designed, and again, as I say, this was one of my first jobs, it was a very low-level job, was the advertising department would send you up the number of ads that they had and what pages they were going to be on. You'd then draw up the spaces that were left after the advertising.
That's where the news goes.
And that's where the news went. And that's the way that the model worked. And they were expensive. Now, you're talking about, and again, I might not have the figures exactly right, but a full-page ad in black and white in the Canberra Times in 1989 would have been about $10,000.
Wow. Yeah.
And that's an extraordinary sum of money.
Whereas now, if you, I'm amazed, to be frank, that there's any classified advertising of motor vehicles in print media, because you just go on to, the various sites, and they all are, and you get more information about them on electronic sites. So the classifieds must be collapsing.
They are. The print advertising has suffered catastrophic collapse. It is no longer sustainable, and the best example of that, of course, is Fairfax, and another example too of where they didn't see this coming. There were opportunities for Fairfax along the way to buy up, because the way that newspapers used to operate, and operate quite successfully, is to kill off all of their competitors. And Canberra was
the ACCC on that.
That's right. Well, and Canberra was a good example. I actually tried to set up a newspaper here in competition to the Chronicle, which was the paper the Canberra Times set up to take care of the local newspaper market and make sure no one else got in. Well, I set up a thing called the Canberra, with Eric Beecher was in fact the one who set up the Canberra Weekly, and I was his editor. Okay. Well, what happened there was that the Canberra Times, through the Chronicle, started giving away free ads against the law. It's actually, it's predatory pricing, but try and get anyone to complain about being given a free ad. Yeah. So they managed quite successfully to kill us off. What Fairfax should have done and seen coming was that as these different bodies arrived, like the capacity to put classifieds online, to put car sales online, just to buy them up, they didn't. And so these
to buy up the online,
to buy up the online stuff to get into that kind of space. And so Fairfax in particular has been very bad at trying to protect its marketplace. Its classified advertising's gone. Its large banner advertising is gone. Yeah. So now the companies are in an absolutely parlous state.
And can we now move on to, that's a good case study, onto what that means for journalism? Because if the paper has fewer resources, going to have fewer journalists, what does that mean for the way journalists behave up on the hill with politicians?
I think this is really, it's interesting. Well, what we've seen over time too is you saw over a long period of time, because papers have really been in decline since I joined them in 1989.
It's your fault.
It possibly is my fault. I probably could claim some credit for that, but it was the stock market crash around about that time.
Of 87.
Yeah, I came in at the time when people would talk about the days of, and talking about the 80s, the $1,000 lunch, the legendary, the expense account, where there was money in newspapers. People could spend a lot of time courting their contacts and their sources and things. It was a more leisurely age. There was money around. If you wanted to travel to do a story, you could. People could travel to do a story and then not produce one, and there wouldn't be huge consequences. Well, there's been an absolute collapse in the number of people who are working in journalism. The first effect I think we saw on it was in the state galleries, where once upon a time they were reasonably healthy. Now, it's a place where there are very, very few people. Right. The level of scrutiny died there, I think. And I don't, you can overstate the importance of journalism. I'm obviously someone who believes that it's important to a democracy.
Sure,
I actually do think that the fact that those state galleries collapsed a bit may in part explain some of the problems that we've seen in state politics around the country. One of the things I think, and you've absolutely seen the collapse up and down the press gallery corridor on the second floor of the Senate, where you walk past that sad Fairfax. The Age, once you could walk past there and it was always full. Now you can walk past it and it's empty. Yeah. It's similar in the Sydney Morning Herald. There has been, the absolute number of journalists has fallen. The other thing I think that's happened is, as there's been a more and more desperate attempt to get money in the commercial media, I think there's been a shriller and shriller form of journalism to try and attract those people who are listening to
again, a good point,
sites.
Chris. I was lining up for coffee in the coffee cart on the second floor of the Senate side called the Press Gallery, and one of your colleagues who was quite frustrated about this said, if we don't have the word crisis in the front of the story, we're in trouble. We will have editors saying it has to be dramatic. Everything has to be dramatic to attract attention. And in the period of the previous government, we would from time to time think we're trundling along, and then suddenly we're told we're in crisis because a piece of legislation was going to be introduced and it may or may not pass. Well, what's new about that? That's true in the Senate, but they're actually explaining that they're pretty much told to use these dramatic words in the first line really.
Yeah, to create the splash, as it's called, the thing that's going to lead the front page. And the other thing too is that the word exclusive seems to be bandied around in a way.
I've seen the same exclusive on 3 or 4 newspapers.
I've seen, yeah, that's right. And the other thing I find amusing is when you've got exclusive on almost every story in the paper. I think it's one of those things, the currency of these things has been degraded by it. Now, look, I think you can, because we're always pining for a better time and things. I think there've been atrocities in journalism since journalism began. The one that I always mention to people is that casts your mind back to the 1890s in the New South Wales Assembly, where John Norton was the editor of The Truth, one of the great colourful characters in Australia's past. He claims to have invented the word wowser, but he used to use his newspapers to absolutely thrash his opponents. He was also a member of the lower house.
There's an idea.
Absolutely. Now, see, run your own newspaper and a scandal sheet. And
Clive Palmer could do that.
Well, he could, but look, he'd struggle to match John Norton, because Norton was such a colourful character and a huge drunk. And he was
eminently qualified as a journalist and a politician.
A Labor man.
Well, there you go. All said
by the way. And there's this story about him with one of his opponents. So he's walking down Pitt Street one day, and this guy who hates him is also an MLA, jumps out from behind an awning with a bullwhip and starts to whip John Norton. So Norton takes off down the street with this guy in pursuit, whipping him with the bullwhip. He then jumps behind a lamppost and pulls out a pistol.
Oh no!
The guy, seeing the pistol, takes off down the street
flight.
and jumps into a horse and buggy as Norton pops off a shot at him. And the next day, it was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald as excitement on Pitt Street.
Excitement! Wow.
So journalism wasn't so great then. Elements of journalism wasn't so great then, and obviously for different reasons. But I do think that we have seen sort of a shriller form of journalism and a more partisan, a parting of the ways. Now, there'd be an argument now that, to a certain extent, Fairfax would roll in behind the Labor Party a bit, and some would say the ABC, of course, would dispute
news
that.
to me.
And that News Limited clearly has decided to cast its lot with the coalition.
That's not news to me.
Yeah, so I think that, and again, there'll be arguments about that, and I'm not going to cast my lot on one side or the other. However, I do think that there is a more partisan tone in what we're seeing now.
And why is that? There's no reason in technology for it to be partisan, is there?
But I think it's a ghettoisation because you're trying to find people who will follow you.
Yes. And I've heard this. Again, a colleague of yours said to me, we used to challenge our readers, now we pander to them.
Fox News in the United States, I think, is the classic example, where you have possibly the most successful television news station in the United States, which makes no bones about the fact that it is utterly partisan. I mean, it's the sort of stuff I find difficult to watch. I watch it for a brief period of time, and then it becomes so repetitious in terms of the ideology, and so narrow. And again, this is commercial news media. I have no real problem with any of this, because in the end, people can spend their money in whatever way they want. People can consume whatever they want. But there has been, I think, certainly in the United States, a ghettoisation in the way that people, because there were reactions to Fox obviously, for more liberal networks decided they'd do the same thing.
So they went their way.
Yep.
Yeah. So that the more liberal ones we're talking in Australian parlance, we think liberal is conservative, but you mean the more progressive ones.
That's right.
They then went after the progressives as their audience, and Fox went after having gone after the conservatives for their audience.
Yeah, look, there is actually, even in the United States, where it's much more pronounced than here, people talk about the fact that people are now almost deciding to live in the same suburbs that have the same worldviews.
Yeah,
and I don't know if that's helped to drive what we see as the sort of uber partisanship now that we've seen in the United States, but certainly, you know, Congress seems to have got.
It doesn't seem to have done the US democratic system much good, does
No,
it?
it's got to the point of dysfunction.
You know, we've seen debt ceiling limits and all of this, and the huge fights about fiscal cliffs and so on. Is this possibly a direction that Australia might head through? Isn't it a fascinating discussion, Chris? Because technology is driving partisanship to an extent because you're, as a commercial media outlet, seeking out your audience and trying to capture it. That's what you're really saying.
It's become more narrowcasting.
Yeah.
I think what we've seen now is that what used to be broadcasting, and they are the only available forms, so you consumed them. If you were interested, you had to consume the papers that were available, or television stations that were available. They had to appeal to a broad base of an audience. You couldn't just try and pander to a particular worldview. What's happened now is we've seen a complete shattering of the audience across so many different platforms, across so many different styles, that people can ghettoise now, that you can seek out news that actually is a reflection
of your own
worldview.
your worldview.
And let's face it, we all like that. How many times? And I
know, look, it's in the paper.
I know.
It's on the telly.
How many times have you read an article which you thought complete nonsense because I just basically don't agree with it or with the premise on it, and then you find something that reflects what you think, and you think that person's spot on, and then you email it to your friend saying this person knows what they're talking about, and that person's a fool. Yeah. And so it's a natural human tendency. It's now being pandered to by the media. I think this is one of those chicken and egg arguments. But you know, we're now in a cycle where perhaps it's the politics is driving the media is driving politics.
Is it a cycle or a death spiral? Because if you keep chasing your audience and pandering to it, the social media is going to increase. Is not going to decrease. So you could be, by chasing your audience, you really are shutting out others.
Yep.
So you're making a pretty big decision here.
The other thing that's happening too is that, you know, while we look, you know, there's a lot of criticism of the old media, and that's fair enough. You know, there are a lot of cases that we have to answer, and that's everybody. That's not just the commercial media. That's the ABC as well. Lindsay Tanner makes very powerful arguments on this. I don't entirely agree with Lindsay, because in the end I feel that you get to the stage where you say, so the political parties, the opposition to the government, are victims of this and can do nothing about it. So I think, you know, we have basically formed a pact, if you like, where we're all responsible for the state of politics and the media as it is now. So I think there's shared responsibility. But the other thing that's happened is that the rise of social media, while tremendous on many fronts, has allowed people, and the only way I can describe it, it's like in once upon a time, you know, the people who had a real big beef would go into a toilet, lock the door and write rude words on the wall. We now have that online, completely anonymous ability to be able to enter into the public fray. And
graffiti.
Basically, and the worst kind of graffiti and stuff that you could never publish. No. Like, there were limits on us. You know, people talk about a free press. We were always very limited by what defamation allowed. So there are whole lots of limits on what you could and couldn't say about someone. There had to be some level of testing of a proof, of a truth, if you like, that you actually had to offer someone a right of reply. Look at the sewer that some of this social media is.
And this is the law here, Chris, that if they, let's say a politician's aggrieved, it's false, it's malicious and damaging, could that politician nevertheless chase that originator down, that person down, if that person could be identified?
I think there have to be some consequences. There has to be some consequence for saying something that is utterly untrue and which does damage.
And certainly the retweeting or the, you'll get someone who's anonymous, and my understanding is Twitter don't see the funny side of telling people who that is, even though they know or they can know. But I suppose if it's then retweeted by people who are identified, that could be a problem.
That's a problem. And the other thing that certainly happened, and we saw this in federal politics, where stuff that essentially originates and gathers steam online, then eventually starts to migrate its way into the mainstream media. Now, leaving aside the rights or the wrongs of what happened with the AWU in Victoria all those years ago, the huge campaign of it, although there was one or two people in the mainstream media, the huge campaign of it was going on online, and the worst of it was going on
that Mike
online.
Smith.
Mike Smith started on, don't forget though, on Fairfax Radio, but actually lost his job.
Yes, he did.
Over the way that this story was covered. Again, I'm not talking about the rights and wrongs of it, but there were consequences in the old media world from management for what was seen as stepping over a boundary. Wherever you draw that line, Mike Smith would no doubt argue that, that he was actually doing something that he sees as a public service. Again, I'm not getting into that. However, then a lot of what went on, and particularly the worst of what went on, say Larry Pickering's excesses, for example, who seems to be a tragic human being, because a once great political cartoonist, worked at the Canberra Times, but now has become clearly an online crank of the worst possible type. That sort of stuff started to find its way, if you like, to migrate across. Not the ultimate extremes of it, but some of the sentiment of it.
Another impact, it seems to me, is that because the money is getting in shorter supply. I do recall the 1980s. I never went to one of those $1,000 lunches. No one ever invited me, even though I was an economic advisor to Bob Hawke. Maybe they thought I'd tell Bob. But, or Peter Walsh, which would have been a lot worse, because Peter,
as long as you didn't pay, he would have been all right with
that. But with less money, it's difficult to employ specialists. And my experience, just quickly, was when we were in government, I'd go in for early morning interviews. And whatever the issue was, the second question after a very short discussion of the interview was, Craig, what are the politics of this? You couldn't get into the substance of the policy issue. It would immediately go to politics. Now, that could be in part because it was minority government and so it was especially sharp. But I wonder too whether we lost so many specialist types of journalists, your social policy specialist, education, your health writers and so on, so that you're left with a handful of journalists in a network or on a newspaper who are just scrambling all day and scrambling with the online content coming through. They don't get the opportunity to read and to drill down into these issues.
I'll give you some examples of the pressures that are now put on journalists, which are simply impossible. So, for example, we have a lockup at federal budget time, which is great. It actually allows you to sit down with the documentation. I mean, leaving aside that, probably not necessary anymore, and people might see it as a way of the government locking them up and being able to sort of proselytise to journalists. I really appreciate it. From the point of view is that no one is going to ask me to talk about this document until I've had a chance to read it.
Yes.
But you think of some of the big things that happened, for example, when climate change policy was the first time around, and you've got these massive documents. Now, that probably a little out of time in the sense that Sky was going there, but 24 wasn't. I'm just trying to think. There was another one where basically you were handed this document and the press release. A camera was waiting for you out the front. As you walked towards the camera, you were reading the press release. Then you stood up in front of the camera, and you maybe had another 2 or 3 minutes to finish the press release and flick through the front pages before someone said, what's that all about? And then the next question is, and what does it mean?
Yes. And why why that pressure? Because there are other networks lined up, and they were going to do the same thing.
Exactly. So you've got say Sky and 24 now in competition to get. So
you don't want, from ABC 24 point of view, Sky to be out in front, and then ABC viewers are saying, "Well, where's our journalist telling us what's in this?"
Now, of course, not every instance is like that, but there are lots of instances like that now where huge, important documents, court judgments, things that are handed down, And once upon a time, there was more time to reflect than to write. And it was always, the deadlines were always tight. It was never that you had a huge amount of time. If you're working in radio, for example, those sorts of things were always there. So, it's always been those sorts of difficulties. But there is real pressure on now, and usually people without much support at all, because everything's been pared back to, it can just be one camera with a link, with a journalist. There's no one there helping you to produce it, talk to you about what might be involved. And so people are asked to make huge calls, instant snap judgment calls on very important pieces of public policy.
Before we get to the ABC, I'd like to have a quick chat about the ABC and its role in all of this. But opinion polls. When we were not going to those $1,000 lunches back in the 1980s, there were only two opinion polls. There was a News poll and I think it was a McNair-Anderson poll. There might have been one other. And they came out once a month in the case of the Fairfax poll and once a fortnight in the case of News poll. That's it. What I was confronted with, doing a lot of the early morning shift, is an opinion poll every day. And leaked polling as well too. So it's not all published opinion polling. It'd be leaked within the Labor Party, or less so, I must say, within the Liberal Party to seek to damage the Labor Party. The damage was done internally by people in the Labor Party. But again, I don't know whether the audience is fascinated with opinion polls. There's no doubt in my mind that journalists were, because I could go for a 10-minute interview and at the end of it saying, well, we didn't actually get to any policy at all.
Yeah, I know.
What's the attraction of opinion polling from a media outlet's point of view?
I think two things is that, it's like fortune telling, is that in the end that people always want to get to an outcome before it actually happens. It's part of human nature. It's like what's actually going on. That it's one of those things that is kind of a measurement of some kind of measurement of where we might be at in the political cycle. There's that. I also felt, though, too, that opinion polling was used basically to drive a particular point of view on occasions. In the end, as you know, it's questions that you ask matter as much.
That's right.
If you're always going to put into an opinion poll preferred Prime Minister plus this other person that's been hanging around for ages, would they be a better Prime Minister than the one that we've got now? They're in the same political party.
Names.
And no names, no pactoral. But then you are setting up a contest.
Yeah. And then out of that becomes, you get a story that kicks on from it. I wonder, the last question on this, maybe they're becoming less expensive too, the polls, because there's a lot of automated polls, which I'm told are not too bad. The ReachTel poll is not too bad. I don't know how much they cost, but the News poll due respect to Morgan, the Morgan poll was big during the 1980s. I apologise. But they were big exercises, big expensive exercises. But if the media doesn't have the money, how come there are so many polls? And the technology of polling must have made it a lot cheaper.
Well, you're right. The automated polls have come in and they are of variable quality, as I understand.
Some are shockers, but others are
there are some really bad ones, and that was proven in the last election campaign. Some of those things are out by miles, And then there was the attempt to try and gauge what was going on in marginal seats, and again, I can think of one or two of those which were just dreadful. In the sense that they were so far out it wasn't funny. So it's some of that technology has become cheaper, and of course, there are ways that you can do things now that couldn't be done in the past, like this.
But it is frightening then, I think, because what we're really talking about here is a superficiality and a partisanship. And I'm not necessarily just talking about coalition versus Labor, but as you say, media outlets diving down a particular, I think you called it the ghettoisation, but it means that there isn't the debate about the national interest and where Australia should be headed. It's more of just a knockdown, drag-out brawl. Yeah,
I think the difficult thing for the political class and, those who work in professional journalism now too is, and, I think everyone does most people are decent and do take these things seriously, is that how do you communicate with a complex message to a mass audience now.
Yeah.
How do you do it? How do you maintain it? I don't think it's impossible. I think that, you know, smart people no doubt are thinking about these things at the moment. And again, like it or dislike it, clearly the Abbott government has watched very closely what happened in the last 3 to 6 years with Labor Party and the media, and made a deliberate decision to try and slow the cycle down and take control of it again. Now, I think there are two things in that. One, I don't think there's any problem with the government trying to do that at all. It becomes a problem if it's just a mechanism to not tell anyone.
To hide,
to hide things.
genuine news.
And I feel that there's a dual thing going on at the
Mm.
moment. So again, without sort of prosecuting that all the way, I think that, but the intention to try and measure your own pace is a perfectly legitimate
Well, I
thing
think
for a
so
government
too,
to
in
do.
that Labor certainly used to lament the 24-hour news cycle, and it's easier said than done as to a remedy to it. But,
I think a
but
huge
this
problem.
government's trying something. Yeah.
I think a huge problem for the government, for the former Labor government, from the word go, a huge tactical mistake was to continue to try and chase the media cycle.
Yeah.
And, you know, again, this is stuff that will be debated forever, but I remember being told by one of the then Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd's media minders, well, it's not a 24-hour cycle now, it's a 15-minute cycle and you need to be up to pace with it. And I thought then that's nonsense. It actually isn't that fast, and that a sensible government would not try to feed the beast.
Yeah.
That you would say, you know, this is what we're talking about. We're going to talk about this for a week. You can interview us as many times as you like. We'd love that.
Yeah.
But this is our topic.
Yeah.
You know,
we're
you
not
might have an
changing.
agenda,
Yeah.
but this is, you need to understand this, and
good
this is what
point.
we're going to talk
Good
about.
point. The role of the ABC in all of this, you alluded earlier to the commercial networks and even other platforms being pretty anxious about the ABC, because the ABC doesn't have to make a profit. But I'm a big supporter of the ABC, and it would be bad if this kind of unlevel playing field was to be seen as a way of, or a justification for taking a lot of money out of the ABC.
Look, I'm obviously a huge supporter of the ABC because they employ me, and I think that it is absolutely a national treasure. However, I understand, and if I was running a commercial media organisation, I would feeling exactly the same way, is that when the ABC now has a huge online presence that is a direct competitor to those people who are trying to make a buck out of it and spending their own money on it, particularly when, and it became quite acute when we set up The Drum, which is an online opinion site.
Yes.
Again, that used to be the province of the commercial world. Well, we now intruded into that space as well. 24, some of them would argue, would be a similar thing because there was already Sky. However, I would say this. My view, and I helped to set up 24, the political end of it, was that as a national broadcaster, you know, it was a difficult decision because it's quite expensive and it had to come from within existing budgets. It did squeeze other things, so other choices had to be made. That the national broadcaster had to be in that space. We didn't really have a choice, that we actually had to set up that organisation. So, but I do understand the commercial pressures. I actually have some sympathy for them. I think it would be an utter tragedy if they all declined. You know, I think we need a strong commercial media. And don't forget, and people talk about commercial media atrocities, some of the best publications in the world, like The Economist, commercial media.
Yeah.
Some of the things that we hold up as being the greatest standard bearers of journalism in the world have been the commercial media, New York Times, Washington Post, you know.
But the ABC is, just listening to what you say, is an electronic device, sends out signals, but the logic of what you're saying is that it's competing directly with newspapers.
Everything's convergence. You had an inquiry on it.
Yeah.
So now we've all landed in the same space. We're all publishers, we're all broadcasters.
The Daily Telegraph could be upset at the ABC, the Australian could be the Sydney Morning Herald, because your online, the ABC online presence could be knocking out either its online presence or its newspapers, its physical newspaper, or both.
Go to the newspaper websites now, and our website, they're indistinguishable. Essentially, we'll have stories on them, which are print stories, if you like, which are the text versions, and you'll click on stories where we've got our video versions of what's been done. You go to the commercial newspaper sites now, they've got the same thing. And, you know, you go to the Australian and they'll have their online analysts who are talking to cameras. So we've seen now the convergence of all media to a point where online it's indistinguishable. We are all doing the same stuff.
And when I said I supported the ABC, my own view, and you might disagree with this, is that the ABC was very critical of the previous government, gave some credit where credit was due. It's not so much about, the ABC is good because it's pro-progressive. Some programs might be a bit more that way than others, but what the ABC offered is the capacity to have a sustained conversation. You know, on say ABC 24, where you could go in and talk about climate change and talk about it for 8 or 10 minutes. Q&A, for example, you can talk about subjects for nearly an hour. 7:30 report. I've had some celebrated debates with Lee Sales, you know, where I was trying to get back onto policy and Lee was on leadership. But at least there is an avenue there. That was my experience. Whereas with some of the commercial outlets, first question, what about the opinion poll? Second, you know, what about leadership? What about crisis? It's just sort of I thought it stifled what the people, I think, want, and that is to be informed about what's going on in Canberra.
I think Sky does a great job too. I mean, I think that Sky, you know, in its political bureau in Canberra, that you have very long discussions with that on that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I do quite a bit of Sky work, and you know, Kieran and David and all those guys are good.
Yeah. So, but yeah, look, I think absolutely. I think that's the ABC's role. The ABC's role is to try and have that space in public policy where these things are discussed. You know, there is a strong line of commentary that, you know, that the ABC is a reflection of a left-leaning inner city suburban elite, if you like, inner city elite, I should say. Well, you know, I guess, you know, you can make those arguments. In the end, people see what they want to see, I think, on a lot of this kind of stuff. I do know, and you would certainly know, that I certainly thought that we were actually quite hard on the last Labor administration. I would argue, because there was plenty of ammunition to work with, but I do know that there are people who who were in very senior positions who thought they were very hard done by in the Labor Party. So I don't think that the ABC was doing Labor any favours necessarily, but I do think that that the organisation always has the capacity to allow people to talk on it, and I don't think that they get shouted down on it too often. It does happen on occasions.
Well, let's see what happens to Auntie, to our ABC. I don't know if it's 8 cents a day, but it'll probably taxpayers are contributing somewhat more, but it does have an important role in this ever-changing media world with the rise of social media. Not all social media exercises are going to work either. But the cost of failure there is much lower, I think, because it's just people
lucky
like
for
us
you
having a crack at MO Forum. So, look, Chris, it's just been a great pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on. I've learned a lot, and I hope that everyone who's been watching episode 6 of MO Forum has also learned. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Craig.
So my name is Dr. Emily Taylor. I work at the Australian National University as a criminologist, and I've been studying the steady rise of CCTV and a raft of surveillance practices.